Nostalgia. It's a powerful, powerful force. And within the realm that is video gaming, I think there's few things that drip with more nostalgia juice than the seminal first-person shooter Rare's Goldeneye 007, a game that, despite its success, was poised to fail by every quantifiable measure. Now, I'm sure we all recall a cutting-edge, immersive, and incredibly explosive action shoot-bang, the first time that an FPS really excelled on consoles, outside of Turok, of course.
I am Turok!
But the behind-the-scenes story paints a very different picture, one where this monolithic pillar of late 90s gaming wasn't just born fully formed and simply squirted onto an N64 cartridge. It did, in fact, have a pretty windy and atypical development lifecycle that by most industry norms shouldn't have resulted in anything memorable. But 24 years later, Rare's game is still being talked about to this day, and you know what's not being talked about? Rogue Agent. But we'll get to that. So slip on your high-tech Rolex and adjust your bow tie, and let's find out what happened to GoldenEye 007. It's 1994, and the powerhouse duo of Ninty and Rare is just starting to heat up. Nintendo, in one of their very sporadic flights of fancy, decided to pay for the license to create a video game based upon the British super spy James Bond, who had his big upcoming 90s relaunch with 1995's GoldenEye. This was most likely due to Nintendo trying to branch out with slightly edgier fare, which was evidenced further by Rare's own Killer Instinct, and the Play It Loud poster that some of you, I'm sure, had on your wall. Since Rare was Nintendo's golden boy and extremely British, they were the natural choice to bring the man with a license to kill to video games, who at that time hadn't seen much action in the medium aside from
James Bond Jr.
Mark Edmond, the head programmer on GoldenEye, recalls how all of this first started within the barns of the studio. Originally, I believe Nintendo wanted GoldenEye 007 for SNES, using the rendering technology that was in Donkey Kong Country. But when Martin Hollis was offered the chance to make the game, he refused to do it on anything other than the N64. It was originally intended to be released with the launch of the console, but didn't make it until a year later. During development, we played a lot of networked Doom in the evenings, along with Virtua Cop. This really helped shape the sort of gameplay we wanted. Everyone was incredibly passionate and really put in the time and effort to make the game as good as we could. That right there, that is a wild timeline to think about. GoldenEye being a 16-bit side-scroller that looks like DKC, but it almost came to pass. This is because the film was set to release in November of '95, which just happened to be one of the Super Nintendo's strongest years, and hell, the gray and purple beast was still getting big titles well into 1996, with several of those being from Rare themselves. The fact it became a massive, innovative N64 mega hit was really only at the behest of Martin Hollis. Mr. Hollis, who the Stamper brothers assigned to head up the project, was looking towards the future, all 64 bits of it. The original idea was to build everything on rails, where the player would be automatically moved to different parts of each level. To make said levels, Rare got easy access to photograph everything they could at the UK film shoots, with the idea being to faithfully recreate the movie sets and give players an explosive arcade-like experience. To fill out the rest of the game's content, since it was the 90s, the internet was barely a thing, so if the team needed references for stuff outside of GoldenEye's scope, additional characters, locations, and weapons, well, they had to resort to other means. Bond books that cataloged his cinematic history had to be scanned, and movies needed to be watched, and rewatched, and watched again, as anything off base or inaccurate would most likely cause the Bond series owners, EON Productions, to raise quite a stink. Which they're going to do later, I can tell you that for free. As for the gameplay itself, like Mark stated, Virtua Cop was a very big influence, but without a light gun peripheral being planned for the N64, they had to come up with an aiming solution, hence GoldenEye's famous crosshair. They'd gotten the first on-rails level up and running, and while everyone thought it was a good bit of fun, their nights playing Doom raised other possibilities. We were using this amazing new invention called the analog stick to aim a crosshair, but then we thought, wouldn't it be cool to play a game like Doom with actual 3D graphics? That would be a new experience, and we knew the Nintendo 64 was capable of rendering 3D graphics from any orientation or direction. Thus, the rails were yanked off the ground and the team decided to give the player full control, but this would, of course, exponentially increase the workload and the time to develop it. Remember, moving it onto the N64 was already going to delay it well past the movie's premiere, more than a year in fact, but as was so often the case, the Stamper brothers were instrumental in shielding the team from any outside pressure to ship an unfinished game. If there were any grumbles coming from Nintendo or more likely EON Productions, well, the team never heard them. They were given the time to experiment, iterate, and polish, which was incredibly useful since this was Rare's first attempt at an FPS, and for the majority of the team, their first professional video game project ever. GoldenEye's art director, Carl Hilton, recalled that Martin Hollis didn't necessarily seek out the most experienced members for his team, but rather the ones that enjoyed their martinis shaken, not stirred. He opened with, "Do you like James Bond?" I was a big Bond fan and it sounded great fun, but I was definitely worried about the reputation that movie tie-in games had back then. I just started at Rare and I knew they didn't release bad games, but I do remember looking at Blast Corps, which was being made next door to us, and thinking it would probably be much more popular than the movie tie-in we were starting on. Those doubts weren't far off the mark, as a lot of new and risky stuff was being attempted at the studio as more and more teams were shifting to the N64. In GoldenEye's case, they were using software packages like Alias and GameGen, and to capture the dozens of unique reactive animations for enemy hits, they were using a new technique called motion capture. In these early days, this amounted to a Rare employee being pushed over again and again for hours to capture the pain of being shot in the groin, or reacting to the almighty headshot, which was also something very new. Most of these ideas were born out of the team's desire to simply create something fun, because since they lacked experience making FPSs, they didn't abide by genre norms or whatever was popular. GoldenEye living meme Dave Dr. Doke Doke admitted that even though the stuff they were coming up with was new and fresh, it didn't always mean they were perfect. The escort missions seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, what could possibly be more fun than having your performance judged on whether Natalia would randomly throw her head in the path of a bullet or walk into an explosion? Then there were some ideas that, while you had to admire the spirit behind them, were probably better off on the cutting room floor. Apparently the team were workshopping the idea of having to remove, then slap in the rumble pack into the N64 pad over and over again as a means to reload your weapon. According to programmer Steve Ellis, Nintendo nixed this idea, much to the chagrin of Stop Skeletons from Fighting, who would probably have been all over that.
My arm already hurts!
Now, it's almost unfathomable that any team working on a big AAA release would get so much leeway nowadays, or be mostly made up of brand new employees. But licenses were a dime a dozen back then, and the Bond license's value was kind of at an all-time low, as most of the late 80s films had underperformed. So GoldenEye was more of a last-ditch effort to appeal to a new generation of filmgoers. And while it did boffo numbers, almost 400 million on a budget of 60, the game did just as well, if not better, selling over 8 million copies at, roughly $60 a pop. This made it the third highest selling game in the N64's history, nestled just behind Mario, Mario with carts, and comfortably ahead of Ocarina of Time, which is just crazy to think about. Steve Ellis gave his take on why this was so. The reason it turned out so well is that no one was standing over you saying you don't need to do that, move on to the next bit. I was on the explosions for a month, and I didn't have someone telling me I'd have a week and that was enough. If there had been, then the game might have been out on time. But our story isn't over here. In fact, we've barely just begun. Bond, James Bond, couldn't stay away from protecting crown and country for long, as GoldenEye's impact in the video game space was something of a white whale that several publishers wanted to recapture. Shocking no one, of course. These two publishers just so happen to be two of our regulars, so allow me to introduce you to EA and Activision. Shortly after GoldenEye's multiple platinum status was confirmed, it didn't take long for Electronic Arts to come sniffing around for the money bucks and offered a lucrative deal to EON for the rights to Tomorrow Never Dies. Maybe feeling that the N64's focus on multiplayer and being an amazing first-person shooter was more of an incidental thing, EA, I guess, felt that any old game could do those sales numbers. Thus, any old game was what we got. Tomorrow Never Dies was a clunky third-person attempt exclusively for the PlayStation that failed to capture the magic of Rare's magic. Although it should be noted that throughout EA's tenure with the license, the games would get increasingly better, peaking with Eurocom's 007 Nightfire. However, the blockbuster system-selling numbers of GoldenEye repeatedly eluded them, so a bit of smoke and mirrors was pulled with 2004's GoldenEye Rogue Agent. If you were either too young or lucky enough to not remember this fiasco, EA created a new villain called Goldeneye because he had a golden eye, in lieu of Bond being the protag. You had to wheel and deal with various other villains in the franchise, and while that was a unique premise, it ultimately didn't amount to much, as it was a hastily thrown together FPS lacking a lot of the series' charm, and wiser fans didn't appreciate the transparent cash grab. Now, back at Microsoft-owned Rare, a faithful remaster of the original GoldenEye running off the old code started gestating. The Xbox 360 marketplace was a booming ecosystem in the late 2000s, filled with various smaller-scale reboots and sequels to classics, so Microsoft had a small team at Rare start upgrading those blurry textures and, all those faces. This happened somewhere between 2007 and 2008, and they did this, of course, assuming there would be no issue in reacquiring the license at all. Also in 2007, that Bond video game license had just changed hands. EA had greenlit an adaptation of Casino Royale to coincide with the movie of the same name, but the game made very slow progress and was cancelled incredibly early on in its production, as there was no way they'd make the release date of Daniel Craig's debut. This, perhaps pissing off EON or just allowing their rights to expire, EA disavowed the secret agent. And that's precisely when Bobby Kotick swooped in atop his fell beast and clamped his oily jaws around Bond's throat. This also just so happened to be when Microsoft finally decided to contact all the relevant parties and to get the remaster into the hands of gamers the world over, since Rare were almost done with it. And it's also where this story gets incredibly complicated. For years, it's been said that Activision, Nintendo of America, and Microsoft had all agreed on terms, with the game set to appear on the Wii and the Xbox 360. Allegedly, though, it was the late Satoru Iwata that somehow had a problem with all of this and declined to give his permission or put pressure on Activision to cancel it, and none of that really makes any sense. Nintendo had zero legal right to any aspect of GoldenEye. Yes, they published it in 1997, but they didn't keep those publishing rights. I mean, they were fine with Microsoft releasing HD ports of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie in 2008, so why would GoldenEye be so taboo? The only companies that had any real power were Activision and EON. If it involved Bond and video games, well, they had the final say on everything. But really, it was EON that trumped Activision, because whenever a new Bond is on the block, it does far better for business if the same face is seen across all media. At least, that's the marketing thought behind it. So it's not really a surprise as to what happened next. Not more than 2 years later, Activision and EON announced Goldeneye 007 for the Wii and 007 Bloodstone for the 360 and the PS3, both games starring Daniel Craig. Now, was it possible that Nintendo paid for a timed exclusive on this GoldenEye remake? Yeah, I mean, they themselves pushed it pretty hard at their E3 2010 stage show and even released golden controllers and shit. But, I mean, it couldn't have been that sweet of a deal, as the Call of Duty-inspired take on the franchise appeared on rival consoles barely a year later in the form of GoldenEye Reloaded, which featured extra content and enhanced visuals and online play. Regardless, Eurocom's GoldenEye remake sold very well on Nintendo's evergreen machine, but Activision then kinda messed it all up with 007 Legends, a rush mess that Eurocom also had to make under a crushing deadline, and therefore were immediately shut down after it flopped. I gotta tackle that game when I'm feeling up to it. Anyway, if you need a refresher about Legends' gimmick, well, it took various older 007 films, many of them not great ones, and replaced all the original Bond actors with, you guessed it, Cranial Dag. Funnily enough, many of the actor likenesses for the villains and the Bond girls remained intact, further illustrating the point that 007 himself is often the issue. This sensitivity to the casting of the character goes all the way back to the legendary deathmatch showdown that took place in Rare's offices back in '97. Right near the end of development, a guy came in from EON who owned the Bond license and saw we had put in Connery, Dalton, and more, as well as Brosnan. We thought it would be great for marketing, and even some screenshots went out with Connery in his white tuxedo. Then, an edict came down from on high, and we had to get rid of the other Bonds. On the day we had to take them out, we played this epic deathmatch, first to 100 kills, which went on for about 3 hours. Mark Edmonds played as Moore and won by 1 kill. It went down to the wire. When you look back on the franchise, almost 25 years of consistent Bond video games, the one time that EON loosened up on this restriction was with EA's very solid From Russia with Love, which brought back Connery's likeness and voice. But this was more of an issue of convenience, because Russia came out in 2005, which was literally in between Brosnan taking off the tux, but before Craig had slipped it on. Okay, well, now back to Legends. Okay, after Legends flopped, Activision let their rights expire, as they did with many other franchises they were publishing around that time, and Microsoft jumped at the chance with the situation now even less complicated. When Rare Replay was being planned for a 2014 release, it seemed like the perfect time to resurrect that GoldenEye remaster, so much so that they even recorded making of interviews with various staff, intended to be included with that collection. The answer from EON was, of course, a resounding no, but it's unknown what the exact issue this time was, because it certainly wasn't Nintendo. Either Rare didn't want to put Craig's face in the game, or nobody wanted to pay Brosnan again, or EON simply stopped caring about video games altogether. As the years ticked on, many bemoaned the lack of Bond, who had had consistent video game presence for almost 20 years, but then suddenly was going on 8 years without a single title to his name. To fill the void, there actually was a really cool looking Unreal Engine 4 remake of GoldenEye being worked on by fans. The keyword being was. Since they announced it existed, EON slapped them with a good old C&D. Stop talking publicly about your fan games based on active franchises, please. Then, out of the blue, a YouTuber, Grazlu00, uploaded a full walkthrough of Rare's Remaster and claimed he received this build from an unnamed party. The build itself was grabbed off of PartnerNet, which was an online testing ground for XBLA titles, not usually available to the public. And if you beat the Remaster's campaign, the end credits prominently display Bring GE Back MGM/EON, which kinda says it all. Looking at the whole picture of this insanity, even if Nintendo had some type of issue with what Rare and Microsoft had made and put pressure on Activision or whatever, that was never going to be the main problem. The main problem is, and always was, the actual owners of the IP, who didn't see any value in re-releasing the old game. Hell, there was never a single remaster or modern port of any classic 007 game, let alone Goldeneye, as EON is simply always about the present and not necessarily the past. As of today, Rare's Goldeneye Remaster is completely playable and beatable through a PC emulator, or with some work, an actual Xbox 360. I mean, I played it a few weeks back, it's awesome, and that's money that EON just left on the table. Lots of people want this to be officially released and on as many formats as possible, but because the franchise owners are so protective, it doesn't seem like it's gonna happen anytime soon. Maybe when IO Interactive's Bond project comes out and does really well, it'll spur further talk about GoldenEye once more, and it might come out officially, who knows? And if it does, generations of gamers can once again enjoy hours and hours of playing on Facility or Aztec, and everyone can have a good time, except for odd job players, because fuck you. If you know of any other sensational shooters that were sadly sacrificed, let me know in the comments below, drive your Aston Martins over to my Twitter, or take a big dumb Union Jack parachute into the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate the subject of our next episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.
Who here would say that it's one of the greatest shooters of all time?
All in favor? Aye! All opposed?
Nay.
Who keeps saying that?
It was him. Let's get him, fellas.